I am joined by Kevin McNamara, who is a physical therapist and currently completing a residency at Johns Hopkins. He's a longtime Clinical Athlete Forum member and the one responsible for bringing the forum or the Journal Club to life. So thanks as always for being on, Kevin. And I still think we're getting his audio set up. But you guys can hear me, so that's step one. Tonight's Journal Club topic is coaching the power clean, a constraints-led approach. And real quick, I've made a few poll questions to get a feel for the type of crowd we got. So I'm going to launch that first question, and it's just our usual, who are you? Clinician, student clinician, coach, trainer. I'm going to ask again. Kevin, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sick. What did you do to fix it?
I don't know. I think.
All right. Oh, we're good. This is good. Okay. Let's see. 25% clinician. That's a good mix today. I figured it would be like this because of the topic is kind of like across the board as far as performance and even rehab with a constraints-led approach. So this is cool. We got a really varied group. Okay, let's do the next one, which is, have you used the power clean as part of your training or your client's training, just ever? Yourself or your client's athletes? Mostly yes, 90% yes. And so let's say you haven't. This paper will still be very relevant. So even though the topic is of the power clean, a constraints-led approach to coaching is just a model that can be used across the board for many different things in regards to movement and that whole realm, and rehab too, and anything in performance. So don't think just because you're not maybe familiar with weightlifting movements or the power clean in particular that this doesn't apply, because it definitely will. And hopefully our discussion will show that. But most of you guys have some experience with the power clean. And then last one. Are you heard? Man, that's bad. That's supposed to say, have you heard of a constraints-led approach to coaching? Have you ever heard of that construct, that model, a constraints-led approach? Constraints-based approach, sometimes it's described as. So a lot of you have, some haven't, which is perfect. No better place to find out about it than here. All right. Well, let's dig in here. So just, if this is your first journal club, kind of the impetus of this and the impetus of the motto that we have is, way back in the day, a smart guy named Benjamin Franklin started a weekly club that was called the Junto Club. It was a mutual improvement club, but it was basically just a room of really smart people discussing topics and the issues of the day, kind of like this. And they had an important policy. And that policy was that all discussions would be conducted in the sincere spirit of inquiry, after truth, without fondness of dispute and desire of victory. And that's what we've made our Journal Club motto. So we're all on the same team. We're just all trying to be less wrong. But that doesn't mean that good discussions can't be had, and even disagreements. So we welcome all that stuff. And we just want to make sure that we're all kind of after the same thing, which is just being less wrong. So let's dig into this thing. The paper itself, Coaching the Power Clean, a Constraints-Led Approach. And hopefully you guys were able to download it. And with the lead author, Wesley Verhoff, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, but this was a commentary. So it wasn't a study per se. They didn't have a trial with different groups trying different interventions or anything like that. It was a commentary and with a team of authors, and they're just kind of giving their thoughts on this model of constraints-led coaching and applying it to a specific movement. And in this case, it was the power clean. And so the introduction moves into comparing some of the traditional coaching models, which is, let's say in weightlifting, this kind of rote repetition, explicit verbal cueing, and kind of a perfectionism-based model where it's a very linear and determined progression. And they, in figure 1, they give an example, starting with holding a barbell and just doing some Romanian deadlifts, just a hip hinge, and then working on the front squat. So you kind of got the hinging part, and you're going from the hinging part of the movement, and then the front rack of the movement. It's like, okay, tick those boxes off. And then you move into a power shrug from the hang, or a pull, kind of an extension. And then you follow that into a power shrug plus a row. So essentially a clean high pull. And then power shrug plus a row plus catch. So maybe you do that in a sequence: clean pull, clean high pull, power clean. And then you could take out the high pull and just do the power shrug and a catch. Or you're thinking about just those combinations in the particular movement itself, like just in the full power clean. You're thinking about shrugging and then catching, kind of in this sequential order as you're doing the movement. And then finally, just the hang power clean. So they provide that 6-step progression as a common model to teach really lots of things, but in very commonly in the sport of weightlifting. And the critique, kind of the impetus of the paper, is they're critiquing that model. And they're saying that rote repetition, or kind of this perfectionism model and this determined just sequential model, it doesn't allow for the learner to really learn, because it's just memorization. And this, like, let's take a step back and say, how do you really learn, let's say, mathematics and things that maybe don't have context unless you care about them or have relevance in your life, and you just memorize things to pass the test, but then you forget it after you take the test, right? Did you really learn it, or did you just memorize it? And so that's kind of what they're getting at here, is if you just have somebody repeat kind of the same thing over and over mindlessly, yeah, they might create the habit because they're just doing so much of it, but it won't stick. They won't necessarily learn the movement. If they come back to it, they might have to just start all over and just keep mindlessly repeating the same thing. And it doesn't necessarily allow for variation of movement. So if you're looking for these movements to just kind of be perfect every single time, well, the argument here is that that's not really how movement works. There should be some variability from rep to rep. You want the athlete to explore different positions to allow the most efficient movement pattern to emerge organically. And so as they kind of learn some movement patterns, let's say, silly examples of catching the front squat with just a completely flexed turtle back really quick, you're going to learn that it's hard to support the barbell, and you have more of a likelihood of dumping the bar forward. So you're going to want to catch it with your torso upright and your hips underneath you, but you kind of learn that organically. And then when you figure that out, the learner then discards the movement solutions that didn't equate to the outcome that they wanted. So the argument of these authors was, and then two, a lot of the common coaching models are based around this coach-centered approach, meaning the coach is in charge, the athlete just does. Coach says, athlete does. And there's no back and forth involved. It's you learn it this way, you do it this way, because this is the way that I'm teaching you. And what these authors propose, number one, is to flip that into kind of an athlete-centered model where there's some feedback back and forth. The athlete has some say into what they feel and what works best for them. Within that, moving towards this constraints-led approach to coaching, where instead of these memorizations or memorizing some sequence of movement to learn, you set up the task to drive the movement solution that you want without having to say a whole lot as a coach. You kind of set up the environment to allow the movement solution to emerge organically. And the athlete themselves just kind of works through that and figures it out. Now, I want to give some contextual background to a constraints-led approach before we dig into the specific examples here in the paper. So constraints-led coaching comes from primarily the dynamical systems model of motor learning. And within that, though, there's ecological dynamics, which is this kind of psychology, sociology construct, how the organism interacts with the environment. So you've got this ecological dynamics model of the world, and then you've got this dynamical systems model of the world. And these two things have a lot in common. Dynamical systems came out of mathematics, statistics, economic theory. Dynamical systems theory is a model to try to explain complex adaptive systems. And we've taken the dynamical systems model and ecological dynamics and tried to apply them to motor learning and motor skill acquisition. And there's been a big push for this, I mean, honestly, for decades, but I would say especially the last 20 years, this has become more mainstream to use the dynamical systems theory and the ecological dynamics approach to motor learning. And a constraints-led approach to coaching explains that a constraint is a boundary condition. And we have kind of three buckets of constraints. We've got constraints of the organism or the individual or the athlete, individual constraints. We have environmental constraints, and we have task constraints. So individual constraints could just be modifiable, non-modifiable things of the individual, maybe output, their range of motion, could also be size, limb lengths, their weight, their cognitive and emotional capacity, types of things. Environmental constraints can be the weather, the lighting, the temperature, the floor that you're performing the movement on. And then task constraints are rules of the game, the implement that you're using, the range of motion that you're moving through, all different types of things. So think of a constraint as a boundary condition. And the idea is that you can manipulate any one of those three buckets or all three in a myriad of combinations in order to drive the movement solution. So I'm going to stop there. And I want to make sure that everybody's still here. Kevin, can you hear me?
Yeah, I still got you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anything to add from there?
No, I think you summarized it well. I think the one thing that's important to kind of reiterate is that the constraints are not causing actions. It's kind of like, as you said, they just eliminate potential solutions. They kind of create boundaries, or almost like if you think about like bumpers on like a bowling alley. It's not that the constraints are producing the movement, it's just that they're eliminating potential options. And I think that's a helpful thing to kind of get across when it comes to perception and action, and just how things self-emerge, because that's the basic sort of baseline understanding of self-emergence, is it's removing potential options to movement.
But to add on that, I think it can work. So if we're going off of James Gibson's perceive to move to perceive,
right?
The constraints can drive action, but your perception drives action as well. So if the bumper example of the bowling alley could be similar to the example that they give here in the paper of setting up the spikes or something like that, kind of constraining bar path. My argument, and I'm actually going to probably talk about this a little bit later, the constraint is going to drive some movement because you're trying you're trying to avoid the constraint, or the constraint is kind of dictating path. But knowing that constraint is in place, I think, can also kind of drive your perception. I think it works both. I feel like there's some two-way action there, but I don't want to get too confusing yet.